Good afternoon or good evening. I'm Roland Greene, director of the Stanford Humanities Center, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to our second annual Celebrate the Fellows event. The first one took place in person at the Humanities Center in the building you see behind me in May of 2019. The arrival of the pandemic obliged us to cancel the one planned for last year, but we're delighted to be able to resume the series now and be together virtually this year. It's wonderful to have so many of you joining us for the celebration of the importance of humanities research to the world. Making such research possible is why the Humanities Center has existed for the last 40 years, and we look forward to sharing more of this research with you in the coming years. Regarding today's presentation, I want to mention that real-time captioning is available. To access this option, click on the closed caption icon at the bottom where it says CC on your screen to start or stop captioning. The up arrow adjacent to the CC icon allows you to show subtitles, view the full transcript, and adjust captions as needed. Each of you registered for this event should have received an online program with biographies of the presenters, and a link to the program is also found in the chat. Accordingly, I will offer only brief introductions of the speakers. In addition to their distinctive accomplishments as individuals, they all represent the exceptional scholarship being done at the center by our fellows, who number more than 40, from distinguished senior scholars to PhD students to undergraduates. As you're about to see, the diversity and complexity of topics and methods is stunning, and we're pleased to be able to give you a look at what's going on behind the scenes. Our format today includes brief talks by 3 current fellows at the Humanities Center. Unfortunately, Professor Raylyn Barnes won't join us today because of family care associated with the pandemic. We send her our best wishes. I want to mention, though, that Professor Barnes, who came to us to spend the year developing a book on blackface, pivoted while at the center to assemble from scratch a different book called Afterlife, Life and Death in 2020 America, in which 22 prominent scholars and activists collaborate to write a history of last year. We're proud to have supported this important project, and I urge you to watch out for Afterlife, co-edited by Raylyn Barnes and Yohuru Williams, which is coming soon. So in today's event, the 3 fellows will share the projects they're pursuing this year with a particular focus on how research in the humanities makes a difference in the world and how they keep that imperative to make a difference in mind as they carry out their work day to day. After their brief presentations, we will proceed to a panel discussion for about 30 minutes. And then for the last segment, they will look forward to taking your questions. Please enter questions into the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. I'd also like to mention that today's presentation is being recorded and will be available on our website in the coming days. And now for brief introductions of our 3 presenters. Speaking first will be Xochitl Marsilli-Vargas, Assistant Professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at Emory University. Then Bernadette Meyler, the Carl and Sheila Spaeth Professor at Stanford Law School. And finally, Carlos Alonso Nugent, a Mellon postdoctoral fellow who spent the year in Stanford's English department and will move next fall to Vanderbilt University as Assistant Professor of English. Without further ado, please start us off, Xochitl.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Roland, for this wonderful presentation. I'm here to talk to you a little bit about my new project, the project that I have been developing at the Humanities Center. And the project's title is Silencing a Scare. And this project started in 2014 when I was volunteered to translate for unaccompanied minors. And many ideas have spawned from that work. So Silencing a Scare analyzes interaction between unaccompanied Spanish-speaking minors who entered the United States from what it is called the Northern Triangle, so El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, who are seeking asylum, and officers of the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, immigration lawyers, and translators. My analysis highlights 2 crucial aspects of these interactions. First, I focus on how the minors' narrative are constructed and shaped in order to fit the legal category of asylee. During the asylum interview, there is an intersection of various communicative agents that have important material consequences regarding the granting of asylums. Among them, we have translators, both present and remote, whose interventions have proven to be critical for granting or not asylum. Cell phones, the digital network used by the USCIS officers who write down the translated testimonies, search browsers such as Google to confirm information or corroborate things that the minors have told, and the presence of the lawyer who is definitely there just to fill in the gaps when the minors don't know what to say. The intersection of these digital spaces and different participant roles produces new forms of understanding evidence. Since the ones providing testimony are minors, important issues of agency, accuracy, and truth emerge. The oral testimony of the minors goes through many mediations, creating a final narrative that in some cases, most cases, differs greatly from the original one. The consequences of these are big because in many cases, the voices of the minors are silenced in favor of a narrative that fits the asylum framework. The second focus of my research centers on how, sometimes overtly, often implicitly, the concept of care is embedded in these interactions through the juridical principle, the best interest of the child, or the BIC principle, and how it plays a central role in judicial decisions about child welfare and child asylum or legal residency applications. The BIC principle, in some cases, most cases, overrides the minor's desires and expectations, complicating cultural, scholarly, and philosophical understandings of agency and intentionality. Silencing and speaking in the name of the minors become common practice when discussing their safety. My research focuses on how the various parties who co-construct the asylum narrative do not only help the minors to create a coherent account that meets the criteria for protection, they also perform care by deciding what best ensures that the minors gain legal recognition as asylees. The BIC principle emerged through the Human Rights Committee in the context of trying to build a unified definition of human rights and test its universality. Consequently, the first problem that the BIC principle presents is its claim of universality. This has been contested since its application invariably depends on the specific conditions of each individual, group, or society. The principle relies upon the value system of the decision maker, and this approach simply creates an unexaminable discretion in the repository of the power. As such, the principle translates normative conceptions of good or ideal family situations into seemingly value-free legal decisions. But these invariably are informed by presumptions about race, class, citizenship, and nationality. The social actors involved in granting asylums to the minors usually invoke commonsensical, toxic definitions of care as something freely expressed that reflects their ethical commitments to the minors. In reality, every actor involved in these interactions conceptualizes childhood, protection, and care in idiosyncratic ways that tend to reflect normative ideals. And I have to say that I was part of this too. Silencing, speaking in the name of, or suspending the minors' voices is possible because of the invocation of care as an overarching principle. The experience of children that migrate are rooted also in hegemonic Western assumptions where the child immigrant is represented as passive and needy, and where their voices are always mediated by adultist discourses. But researchers have argued that under these Western conceptualizations, childhood is understood as a biological state rather than being social beings in their own right. This means that underage individuals are seen as not competent enough to discuss their own experience, resulting in a predominantly talking for instead of talking with them. The position of asylum-seeking minors then must be considered through the strong symbolic value on how children have been constructed and portrayed as society's most vulnerable and valuable, given these moral undertones, conceptualizations of the suffering child have a very strong rhetorical force. Once groups are, and this is problematic, sorry, because once groups are designated as vulnerable, as unaccompanied minors are, they may end up being reified by both political and academic institutions in a position of powerlessness and lack of agency and resilience. Thus, my work as a scholar is to pay close attention to the politics of vulnerability, which are directly related to various degrees of precariousness, thus not the same for everyone and subject to power plays. This way, we can move away from a framework that conceptualizes asylum-seeking minors as lacking agency and give them instead the opportunity to voice their concerns. Thank you very much. This is my presentation.
Thanks so much to Xochitl for that wonderful presentation. And and also thanks to Roland for his introduction. I'll be talking briefly about my book that I'm completing at the center this year on common law originalism, the Constitution's contested meanings. A majority of the justices on the US Supreme Court and an increasing number in the federal judiciary more broadly endorse an originalist mode of constitutional interpretation. They believe that when applying constitutional principles, judges should look to the original public meaning of the US Constitution, which was fixed at the time of its ratification, and that this meaning should constrain their interpretations of the Constitution today. Justices writing from an originalist vantage point have, in recent years, changed the law of the land pertaining to gun ownership, defendants' rights to confront the witnesses against them, and states' immunity to suit, and may soon eliminate the constitutional basis for a woman's ability to choose an abortion. But many of the powers and rights articulated in our written Constitution emerged out of the more flexible, evolving British common law, which relied on legal precedent to secure liberties. My research and forthcoming book examine how we can reconcile originalism with this common law tradition, particularly in light of the settler colonial origins of the US Constitution and its constitutive exclusions at the founding moment. Within my work, I bring basic questions of literary interpretation and historiography to bear upon issues of constitutional import. In a biographically interesting turn of events, the late Justice Antonin Scalia, one of the pioneers of originalist interpretation, was the son of a professor of Romance literature who espoused new criticism, a theory of interpretation that bears significant resemblance to Justice Scalia's insistence on deriving the meaning of the Constitution from the document itself, rather than seeking insights from either the framers' biographies or present-day circumstances of the Constitution's application. Debates about the fixity of meaning from the humanities can inform the critique of originalism, just as earlier methods in literary criticism influenced its rise. The effort to discern a singular meaning of particular constitutional clauses assumes that, in the vast majority of cases, that singular meaning will exist. There were, however, a wealth of colonial and state common laws available in addition to British common law at the time of the founding. Many constitutional clauses can be understood against the backdrop of those common laws. The concomitant variations in how certain powers and rights were understood suggest that a number of clauses would have had different meanings to different ratifiers. The holy grail of the original meaning is therefore often elusive. Acknowledging this fact would make a difference in the way that the Constitution is understood today. Judges approaching the Constitution from this vantage point would accept that there is some play in the joints of constitutional meaning, and that their task is to explain and implement their best judgment, taking into account the various debates that occur in the public sphere rather than only within the courthouse. A controversy that unfolded in the late 19th century, I believe, demonstrates a successful outcome of such a process. After the 1868 ratification of the 14th Amendment, which first defined citizenship in the Constitution, questions arose about whether the clause, quote, all persons born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States, unquote, whether that clause excluded from citizenship any child born of foreign parents in the United States. This debate had particular salience for Chinese Americans in light of increasing resistance to Chinese immigration, particularly on the West Coast and the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. Arguments about what subject to the jurisdiction thereof really meant raged in the public press, in law reviews, and in treatises for 30 years until the case of United States against Wong Kim Ark resolved the issue in 1898, determining that it would be absurd to consider Chinese immigrants within the United States not subject to US jurisdiction, considering, among other things, what that would mean for the criminal law, and upholding the longstanding common law principle of subjecthood or citizenship by birth within the territory. The meaning of citizenship by birth under the 14th Amendment was thereby settled not solely in accordance with the text of the document, nor through resort to pre-constitutional background meanings, but instead by a decision after considerable public debate that aired the various possible understandings of the clause. This kind of decision, I believe, possesses a depth of democratic legitimacy that a particular set of justices' contemporary guesses about original meaning lacks. Democratic legitimacy is crucial because arguments about democracy undergird the justification for originalism itself. Unelected judges, the story goes, should refrain from overturning the will of democratic majorities as expressed in legislation and executive actions unless they have a clear mandate from the Constitution, which furnishes a super-democratic basis for decision. But what my work demonstrates is that that clarity may be elusive. This does not mean that judges should refrain from deciding cases based on constitutional principles at all. Instead, they should be explicit about the limits of certainty and foster democratic debate about what to do in its absence. Thanks very much. I look forward to our conversation.
Good afternoon. I'm Carlos Alonso Nugent, and I'm pleased to be with you this afternoon or evening or whatever time it is. And I just want to thank briefly everybody at the Humanities Center who's made not just this event, but this whole year possible for all of us fellows. It's really been such a privilege to be here. So I'm writing a book at Stanford called Imagined Environments, Mediating Race and Nature in the US-Mexico Borderlands. And I'm building on a long tradition of scholarship that's tried to understand how the US-Mexico border divides citizens and migrants, whites and racialized peoples, upper classes and working classes. All too often, this body of scholarship has failed to recognize that the human identities that result from the actions of the US-Mexico border are intertwined with non-human environments. For instance, that whiteness is inseparable from water infrastructure, or that Latinidad is linked to various forms of land tenure. Even more frequently, scholars have failed to situate contemporary border crises, like the one Xochitl just discussed, the practice of caging migrant children that's unfortunately become common here. Scholars have failed to situate these crises within wider border cultures, such as the literature and art that shape attitudes toward migration. So as a result of these failures, scholars are ill-equipped for futures in which the US-Mexico border runs through the heart of global politics, and in which the borderlands suffer severe effects from global warming. In the book I'm writing at Stanford, I face these futures in two ways. First, I develop a theory of imagined environments, which is my term for the frameworks through which human groups represent, relate to, and reside in their more than human worlds. Next, I apply this theory to a range of archives in order to revise accepted accounts of the borderlands from 1848 to the present. In the Q&A, I'd be happy to describe some of the specific features of the story, some of the characters who make appearances, but for now, I'd just like to focus on the ways that an apparently abstract theory about imagined environments might change our concrete sense of ourselves, each other, and our precarious planet. In some contexts, the word imagined connotes fantasy or fictionality, but but in the wide-ranging scholarship of the humanities on social imaginaries, this word denotes an all too real process in which independent individuals recognize themselves and others as unified groups. Developing this scholarship, I define imagined environments as seemingly natural ways of perceiving and thinking that take shape through contingent practices of writing and culture making. Filling a gap in the existing scholarship, I argued that imagined environments affect not only human identities like gender, race, and class, but also more than human entities, from earth and water to plants and animals to chemicals and machines. While insisting that imagined environments can operate in any place or period, I focus on ones that have formed and transformed the borderlands since 1848. Sometimes I show how these imagined environments have influenced aesthetic judgments, how they've taught many whites that Santa Fe is beautiful, that the Grand Canyon is sublime, and that the Trinity nuclear test site is ugly. Other times I demonstrate that these imagined environments have enabled ethical evaluations, that they have allowed Nuevo Mexicanos to associate the Rio Grande with irrigated agriculture, and that they have supported Taos Indians who see Blue Lake as sacred. At all times, I emphasize that these imagined environments have helped to produce the phenomena that they have sometimes seemed to merely portray. Much as Benedict Anderson's famous concept of imagined communities, much as those have fueled nationalism, and much as Edward Said's famous concept of imaginative geographies have contributed to colonialism, the imagined environments that I discuss in my work have changed how we understand and use almost every part of the planet. Through this theoretical lens, I reveal stories of the borderlands that have been invisible to, but will become important for, US literary studies, Latinx literary studies, Native literary studies, Western history, and art history. Moving from the US-Mexico War to the present, I engage with novelists like Willa Cather, essayists like Fabiola Carece-Vaca, and activists like Cesar Chavez. Beyond the canon of literature and art, I also examine promoters who encouraged whites to claim homesteads, periodistas who emboldened Latinxes to protect pueblos, and leaders who helped natives fight for sovereignty. By following these figures through the borderlands, I recovered different ways of depicting and dwelling in the same natural environments. Of course, many of these imagined environments have participated in the interlocking processes of settler colonialism, racial capitalism, and ecological degradation. However, some of these imagined environments have offered alternative approaches to exploring spaces, engaging with beings, and consuming objects. As I tell these two tales in their interdependent indissolubility, I've been very grateful for my time at the Stanford Humanities Center. And here in this interdisciplinary community, I've been able to understand some of our problematic pasts and also to imagine more resilient futures. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. And thanks to the three of you. I know how difficult it is to summarize these important projects in 5 minutes each. So I'm grateful to you for compressing so elegantly projects that extend in so many directions. So I'd like to start, we're going to have a brief panel discussion before we take questions from the audience. And I'd like to start with a question for all of you. Obviously, the three of you are pursuing your projects independently of each other and in different disciplines. Xochitl is trained as an anthropologist. Bernie is a scholar of both law and literature, and particularly of legal interpretation. And Carlos studies the US-Mexico border from the perspective of literary, cultural, and environmental history. At the same time, all of you are working on topical matters. If I turn on the news right now, in the next hour, I will hear something that touches on at least one of your topics. And certainly over the course of the day, I'd hear about all of your topics. So my first question, which is the answer to which I think was implicit in all three presentations, but I want to invite you to say more. Why do we need the reflective work of a scholar to understand asylum seekers, to understand how we read the US Constitution, and to understand the US-Mexico border as an environmental space? One might say we could simply leave these matters to, say, lawyers and immigration officers in Xochitl's case, to judges in Bernie's case, and to engineers and activists in Carlos's case. how does society's interest in these topics benefit from your humanistic point of view, and in particular from the fact that you spend a year in reflection at a research institute? So any one of you can answer first. I want to hear from all of you on this question. Thanks.
I'll take a stab at it first,
Please.
if that makes sense. Yeah. So I think in terms of my topic, I think that this is a great question, sort of why do we need this humanistic point of view? There's one answer to it from my perspective, which is that actually our legal institutions are all already imbued with some forms of humanism and of a humanistic viewpoint. I think the example of Justice Scalia's father, who was himself a new critic, is kind of not unique in that regard, that we have a way in which the cultural and the literary were already received within the American legal system. And so we need scholars who can kind of unpack that for public audience as well. But I think also that the tools of literature and literary theory are extremely helpful in trying to understand what's really going on in constitutional decision-making or legal decision-making more generally. And I heard resonances of that with Xochitl's presentation also in terms of the narratives that she's talking about. But I would just give the example that sometimes I have my first-year constitutional law students read the unredacted versions of the opinions in the healthcare decision from a few years back, the Affordable Care Act decision, and really analyze why the justices choose to present the issues in the order that they do. Each opinion has a very different ordering of the material, and that has extremely important significance for the arguments that they're making. And we tend to, if we're just reading it from a legal perspective, naturalize that order and think, oh, well, that makes sense, or that other one makes sense. But I think once we can take apart the arguments and read it really almost as a literary scholar would, it comes to seem like a very different document than if you just read it from a doctrinal vantage point.
Great, thank you.
Well, and if I may, I'm just going to jump in. And I agree with everything Bernie is saying. And as an anthropologist, also, I think that one of our what we do is to shake the habitual, in the sense that we try to uncover the obvious, right? We try to unnaturalize what people tend to see as, well, things are like this. So therefore, there is no discourse in the actions that we make. And in the case of minors, immigration, and asylum seekers, I found that it is really, really important to understand how these minors are being conceptualized as really agency-less. And I was very surprised because, again, in anthropology, we tend to see childhood as something that is culturally constructed and not universal. But the way in which children are being conceptualized when they come to the US is the same way that we conceptualize them, which is almost like in a, like, for instance, some people have told me when I presented this work that, well, but you know, their brains are not developed yet. So therefore you need to make decisions for them. And that's a very particular, very, I mean, interesting way of understanding childhood, but it's only one way of understanding childhood. So I think that you need the perspective of anthropologists, of humanists, social scientists to tell people that these kids are, I mean, and some of them are come directly from indigenous communities with very different upbringings, and they have been the sole responsible of their households since age 5, for instance. So therefore, I think it's important to show, I mean, our work as researchers, that to destabilize meanings and commonsensical notions of, in this particular case, what being a minor is.
Yeah, I think I have a similar response to both Bernie and Xochitl, colored in part by my training in and involvement with the environmental humanities. one of the striking things when you look back at the archives of environmental awareness and activism is that humans have known for decades that climate change is all but certain to transform this planet that we have. All of the information is there, and Roland mentioned two figures who are often at the center of these controversies and conversations, engineers and activists. They've had the information at their disposal for decades, yet humans have consciously and also just unintentionally not done very much about it. The planet seems hurtling ever more precipitously toward this precarious future. So I think that the role of the humanities in this, first of all, is to look back and not try to come up with solutions from scratch, but to recognize the many possibilities that lie in our past. So in my research, I've looked at a group called the Alianza Federal de Mercedes, which was branded as a militant or even terrorist organization by the United States. But actually in their archives, in the texts and images, radio broadcasts, television specials that they created, they modeled an approach to surviving in the desert that was based not on transforming it to create the conditions for what we think of as comfort for the swimming pools and golf courses and other things in my hometown of Tucson, Arizona, but rather for tolerating the constraints and contingencies that are inherent to this region. So I think that the humanities can teach us about the resources that are already at our fingertips, even if they're not quite so obvious. I think the other thing, and here I feel quite similar to Bernie, is that the engineers and activists who fashion themselves as those who can solve all of these problems, and clearly I don't think that the humanities can deal with climate change without engineers and activists, but I think one of the things is engineers and activists are also communicators. They write, they create images, they address publics, they draw on the ideas that are at their disposal and try and modify them. And if you look back at these people and read them much as we read the lyric or the novel or other literary genres, you find that many of these seemingly disinterested, purely objective scientific ideas are also colored by things like settler colonialism and racial capitalism, or working against those things. So if you can read engineering and activism like a literary text, you can actually learn quite a bit.
Thank you so much for all. Those are really compelling answers to that question that we get asked so often. I know you do, I do, and I'm grateful to you for articulating that for our audience today. I have a couple of other questions before we get to the Q&A from the audience, and I can see that questions from the audience are starting to come in. Let me just quickly invite those of you who are in the audience who want to pose questions, again, to use the Q&A function and submit them. And when the time comes in just a few minutes, I will pass them on to our speakers for their thoughts. But let me ask you, the three of you, another question, and I think it digs a little deeper than the first one. I know your work, all three of you, because I've heard you present, and also I read your work when we were inviting you to join the center this year. And one thing that one could say about what a humanistic perspective brings to the areas that each of you is working on is that there are often central concepts that are illuminated in work like yours. And so if I were going to identify a term or a concept that for each of you, I would say, based on my knowledge of your work, you are theorizing, you are bringing a kind of renewed and critical attention to each of these concepts. I would say that maybe for Xochitl, it would be something you've mentioned a couple of times already, care. For Bernie, it might be something like fidelity, or the sense in which people often say, and especially people in public discourse often say, we have to show fidelity to the Constitution. And for Carlos, I would say a word you just used a moment ago, something like consciousness or unconsciousness, because I know it's part of your argument that literature plays a crucial role in promoting consciousness of certain things about the environment, but also bringing about unconsciousness of certain things. So could I invite each of you to say something about each of these, about the term that is relevant for your work and how the way you develop it, you see it contributing to the discourse around in your field and the people your work is responding to. So if you don't mind, Xochitl, care, Bernie, fidelity, and Carlos, consciousness or unconsciousness.
Thank you, Roland. Yes, of course. Thank you. Yes, care was actually not what I was thinking at the beginning of my research. I was just interested in how the narrative of the asylum narrative was constructed by all of these different technologies. But every time I was there trying to translate for the kids, it was interesting how their voices were silenced. And it was always through this particular framework of, we care about you. You don't know what you want. We care about you. We're going to protect you. And that was what I started to think about care as an important subject, as an important word, as you said, that guided the research. And care, it seems to me that it's one of those words, again, that seems to be commonsensical. As we say, doxic conventions about the meaning. Care means something positive. And of course, there are a lot of feminist scholars who have challenged that particular reading of care, because we know, for instance, especially that in the domestic space, care has been used in a very coercive way, and it's always placed on women, and it's always something they have to do. But I haven't read, or I haven't found anything about caring for children in this coercive way. And in these particular interactions, it was obvious that, at least in many, many cases, the minors had very clear ideas of what they wanted and how they wanted, and they were completely silenced under this idea of protection, care. So I think that care the coerciveness of care, although it has been explored, again, as I said before, not in this particular framework in granting asylum. And again, it has to do with this discursive representation of the children as vulnerable. And yes, they are vulnerable. I'm not trying to say they are not, but they're also resilient. They also have desires, and they also have agendas that are always dismissed by adults. And this is, I think, it's a very important topic. It's a very important theme that needs some examination. So how care silences, how care is oppressive, and in this particular case, it overrides the decision of these minors. And so I think it's important to review it. Thank you, Roland.
Thank you. Bernie, fidelity.
Yes, well, I think fidelity is an incredible concept in constitutional studies today, because no one says that they're not being faithful to the Constitution. And so this is something that people on the left and right agree on, that we're all faithful to the Constitution. But then the question is what that really means. And I think that if we look further into fidelity and try to unpack what's at stake in fidelity to the Constitution from different sides, also historically, we see that what is meant by the Constitution is sometimes a different object. So I think that it really has to do with almost an ontology of what is a constitution and what a constitution should be doing, the question of what we're faithful to. And I find very powerful a metaphor that Sir Matthew Hale, who was an important common law thinker in the late 17th century, put forward, which was this metaphor of the common law as like the ship of the Argonauts, which went out and then came back a totally different ship. It had been, all these boards had been changed, and it had been altered in all the particulars, and yet it still could be identified as the ship of the Argonauts. And so Hale thought that this was the guiding metaphor of the common law, that you don't need some kind of fixity of each individual part. You can retain a whole, even if everything about it changes. Now, that wasn't always the way the metaphor was understood. Someone like Jean Baudin in the 16th century had talked about the sovereign as needing to be beneath that, or as the master of that ship, guiding the continued identity of the object. So I think part of it is about what makes the Constitution continue to be the same thing over time when circumstances change. I think originalists would say that actually fidelity to the Constitution means fidelity to the meaning at the time of ratification, whereas living constitutionalists would say we're equally faithful to the Constitution, but that fidelity is based on the principles that are underlying constitutional provisions. And of course, the particular applications and the particular meanings have to shift over time as society transforms. So what's at stake, I think, really is kind of what is fidelity to, and what is it for? And I would just briefly mention that historically also there's been a remarkable sense in which the Constitution was the source of a lot of controversy and was the grounding for a lot of controversy, but most people didn't disclaim the Constitution. So we have someone like Frederick Douglass reinterpreting the Constitution and saying, it's not a pro-slavery document, defending it as it's not a pro-slavery document because it never explicitly mentions the word slavery. I'm rejecting all of the pro-slavery interpretations of it because it doesn't use the word. And so he's kind of holding the Constitution to a higher standard based on its own text, but still maintaining this idea of fidelity to the Constitution. Now, I think that that idea may have reached its endpoint in some respects. Today, I think we see a lot of second and third generation constitutions that do a better job at thinking about social and economic rights, or thinking of Carlos at environmental rights, than the US Constitution. It's not entirely clear how much motion can actually take place under the US Constitution in those regards. But I think that for me, the importance of fidelity to the Constitution is fidelity to this common object that we can argue over, that it's the text that we all share as a nation, and that we can all ground a lot of our common disputes on that text.
That's a wonderful,
thanks, Roland.
That's a wonderful gloss. I just want to say that's a wonderful gloss of a word that you hear so often in public discourse. Thank you, Bernie. Carlos, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think fidelity is the title of a Jonathan Franzen novel too, or something. So you could help us. Yeah. So yeah, I appreciate the question about consciousness. I mean,
do I read you right? Is that an important concept for you, or can we?
Yeah, certainly.
I mean,
yeah, I think an imagined environment is something that constructs consciousness, that makes certain forms of consciousness possible, that makes it possible for us to think that a particular environment is useful or useless, safe or dangerous, beautiful or ugly. And one of the things that I'm trying to do in my book, it seems to me like environmental literary criticism or eco-criticism, and really the environmental humanities more broadly, have done a very good job in talking about the ways that literature in particular, but also various forms of culture more generally, can raise awareness. We all know very well how John Muir's essays helped persuade people to create the national park system, or how Rachel Carson's book persuaded publics to ban pesticides like DDT that were economically productive, but ultimately ecologically destructive. We know this story very well. But the story that is less well known, and one of the things that I'm trying to make it possible to tell with my theory of imagined environments, is about the production of unconsciousness, the ways that text and images and other media make it possible for us to deny or disguise or disregard our abuse of the planet. And I think that unconsciousness is not just something that inherently exists and needs to be remedied. Humans don't move inevitably from blindness to illumination, from stupidity or ignorance to knowledge. One of the things that's really striking in the archives of the borderlands is that even in the late 1840s and early 1850s, this decade that is thought of, or this period that's thought of as a slide towards civil war, with these unrepentant racists moving from the US South to the borderlands and trying to bring enslaved Black folks there. These people actually understood much better than their counterparts later in the 19th and in the early 20th century that the desert was no place for plantation agriculture. So these people, with all of their problems, were able to appreciate at least one basic fact, which is that there's not enough water in most of the US-Mexico borderlands for Eastern style agriculture. This unconsciousness of just how uninhabitable this region was is something that had to be actively produced. It wasn't just some ignorance that people had and was quickly dispelled. It was something that persisted throughout the late 19th and into the early 20th century. And even now, when people think about the desert as a site for aesthetic and spiritual freedom, And one of the things that I'm particularly interested, just by way of conclusion, is the way that awareness and unconsciousness can become intertwined. A central set of figures who I talk about in my work are the predominantly white modernists who moved to Taos and Santa Fe and other artist colonies in what's now New Mexico in the early to mid 20th century. Folks like Georgia O'Keeffe, Ansel Adams, Mary Austin, Willa Cather, Mabel Dodge. These people were trying to raise awareness, and in some cases they did. Most famously, Mabel Dodge and Mary Austin helped persuade the US Senate to scrap this thing that was called the Burson Bill that was going to dispossess the 23 Pueblo peoples who live in what's now New Mexico. So they were very successful at raising awareness. But one of the things that the beautiful paintings of Georgia O'Keeffe, which were trying to appreciate the desert, not in the commodifying terms of capitalism, but rather in a sort of purely aesthetic form, looking at mountains and flowers and skulls or whatever else for their own sake. One of the things that these art objects did was blind people or make it harder for people to see that the desert was already succumbing to these very destructive processes. So I'm interested in these intertwined histories of awareness and unawareness or unconsciousness.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. Now I'm going to start weaving in questions from our audience. And again, let me urge those of you in the audience to keep sending them in so I can pass them along. Xochitl, I have a question for you. I want to invite you to talk about the origins of your project. You say that you started working with unaccompanied minors who were petitioning for asylum, and you started off as a translator in different institutional settings. What prompted you to focus on these interactions among the minors, the immigration officers, the lawyers as an object of study?
Thank you for that question, Roland. Well, I mean, I'm a linguistic anthropologist, so language has always been something that interests me. So in 2014, we had the first big wave of migrant children, and it was approximately 104,000 kids came to the borders and were detained, and Obama at that point expedited the asylum process, and they were sent, because we've seen a lot of harrowing pictures right now about the kids being in cages, etc. That has not been always the case, and it's a very complex process. And I want to just make sure that everybody knows that it's a very difficult problem to suddenly have a huge amount of kids, and what are you going to do with them? Where are you going to place them? So I tried to help in any way I could, and the only way I could, because I'm not trained as a lawyer, was, well, I know English and Spanish, so I'm going to try to go and translate for them. So I did a lot of work with pro bono lawyers, but especially with nonprofit organizations who were trying to expedite the asylum cases for these kids, which have to fit 5 categories. And so basically it started to be very interesting is how, I mean, and this is really interesting, there are no lies involved in these interactions, but the lawyers are asking particular questions so that they get the answers that they need in order to fit the 5 categories of asylum petitions. And that was a really fascinating to see it as a linguist. But even more fascinating was the fact that I was translating, and then there was a virtual translator who was monitoring my own translation. And in some cases, that person would intervene with a lot of different results, for instance, because we were not allowed to translate pragmatics, so language in context, so we cannot translate idioms, but they can. So it was really interesting to see how just one word from this person who happened to be Mexican or Salvadorian and know the meaning of this word in its context could that was the decision to grant asylum or not. So that was really, really just to see these different actors creating this narrative that at the end was presented. And again, I mean, with our ideas of objectivity, there was nothing objective in this. And now also with all the intersection of new media, I mean, Google, sometimes a kid would say something and they will go to Google and trying to find dates and stuff like that. So I just, as a linguist, that was just an incredible place to see language in a very different light. And of course, care, which was, once I was there, again, the question of care, the question of protection was always there. So I decided to pursue it as a project with which I have to be honest, has been very difficult with IRB processes, but but I think it's worth exploring.
I remember that when you gave your talk to the other fellows at the Humanities Center, you gave us an example of one of those situations where you were not permitted to translate something. Do you remember that example?
Yes, of course.
Again?
Yes, thank you, Roland. Yeah, so it was the word ranchero, which for some of you who might know Spanish, ranchero, it's kind of what you call someone who works in the fields, but also it has a very derogatory conceptualization. So if you call someone a ranchero, you're calling that person unsophisticated, brute, stupid. And so when a minor was trying to tell the UCIS officers that they were being discriminated against, he and his family, and they were called rancheros, I translated that as countrymen, which of course it's not a very nice translation, but that was what I was allowed to do. And then the coincidence, and it was a great coincidence that the virtual translator at that point was Mexican, interrupted the session and said, "Officer, I just wanted to say that ranchero in Mexico, it's a very derogatory term and it means X, Y, and Z." And just by that, the kid was granted asylum because they needed the discrimination part. So the materiality of language is incredible in these environments, and I'm sure Bernie has similar stories. It's just one word that can change the whole case. So yes, language is very material in these particular spaces.
Thank you for that. I'm glad I remembered correctly that you had given us that example. I'd forgotten the word. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Bernie, you will like this question from the audience. Why do we need a constitution at all if it is subject to such wide, subjective, contemporary interpretations?
Great. So I would say that, first of all, the meaning of the Constitution is not entirely open, even if it is debatable on a lot of fronts. It's not a blank screen. We still need a Commerce Clause that enables Congress to make legislation pertaining to Congress. We still need a clause that says that there's equal protection under the laws. So there are these basic concepts and basic ideas that can be then debated. But I think that I would fundamentally, in answering this question, come back to the idea that I mentioned before in talking about fidelity with you, Roland, which is that it really is a text that we can co-deliberate about, so that it's a source for structuring public debate, I think, and it can allow us a common ground for various kinds of disputes. I think there's some really interesting work that's been done on the way in which social movements have galvanized around particular constitutional clauses, whether it's in relation to the Second Amendment and trying to promote rights of gun ownership, or whether it's in relation to gay marriage. So there's been a lot of interesting work showing how people are able to kind of come together and coalesce around particular constitutional provisions and make an argument that winds up then persuading courts to follow it, that someone should be included or another right should be included under the Constitution. So I think those are the reasons I would say that we still need a Constitution.
Thank you. Carlos, you're working in such a complex area with the cultural history you're telling, the environmental history. And in a way, I want to ask a question a little bit like what I asked Xochitl about the origins of your interest in this, but also what have you found most surprising in bringing these fields together? And what have people found most surprising about your work when you talk to people who work in the separate areas that you are bringing together?
Yeah, that's really three questions for the price of one, isn't it, Roland? What brought me to this? The honest answer is I think one that many of my colleagues in the humanities share is this set of interests is really important to me personally, and is something I was thinking about long before I came into academia. My family, half my family is from Cuba and half is from the United States, and I grew up in the borderlands. So like many people there, I'm from multiple cultures, some Spanish speaking, some English speaking. Of course, I was different from many of the Mexican folks who I grew up around. And so what struck me on the one hand was these various forms of hybridity or mixture, these experiments that have taken shape in the borderlands, these exciting fusions of very different peoples, but at the same time, the very extreme and sharp antagonisms, the huge amount of violence that has made communities like the one that I grew up in, Tucson, Arizona, possible. And this sort of paradox became ever more urgent to me, watching, for instance, the seasonal monsoons that used to be quite regular in Tucson, now no longer occur, only occur every 4 or 5 years. And that's a change, combination of the long-term cycles of drought in the Chihuahuan and Sonoran deserts, but also exacerbated by anthropogenic climate change. So that's how I came to this set of concerns that's ended up becoming my book. I think the thing that is often surprising to outsiders, to folks who don't know very much about the borderlands or who have latched onto one of the nationally or internationally prominent imagined environments, is the long history of communities that we could now call Latinx in this region. Folks think about the borderlands in particular and the Americas in general as if Latinx folks suddenly arrived coming out of nowhere, in the 50s or something, in the age of the Bracero program, or in the 80s and 90s when undocumented immigration became an increasingly prominent concern for some US Americans. The fact remains that people have been speaking Spanish in the Americas for much longer than they've been speaking English, that the first people to have the first sort of European descended settlements in what's now the United States are all in Nuevo Mexico, and that Latinx communities have been shaping the literature and culture and the art of what's now the United States from before it was the United States. And one of the things that surprised me in this, during the time that I've been in California, I started writing a part of my book about the gold rush that occurred shortly after the region that Stanford's campus is located in was claimed by the US. And a gold rush took place there, as everybody knows. One of the things that was very surprising to me, I had the suspicion that many of the first miners would have come from Mexico, which did turn out to be the case. Many others came from Chile. And one of the things that's been interesting for me to find in my work is that the concept of a multi-ethnic Latinidad, which is to say some sort of common Latinx identity that spans people even from Chile and Sonora, Mexico, actually took shape under the pressures of US colonialism, of the people who were dispossessing these first waves of Spanish-speaking miners, forcing them to find common cause, even if the ones from Chile and the ones from Mexico would have previously considered themselves quite different. So that's something that surprised me during my time researching at Stanford.
Okay, thank you. You know what I'm going to do before we finish? We're 2/3 of the way through this event. We have half an hour to go. I'm asking you questions from our public audience. When we get to the last 10 minutes or so, I think if I have time, I may invite each of you to pose a question to another one of you. In other words, to get the three of you talking to each other about each other's projects. So I'm giving you fair warning. You might start thinking about a question like that, and we'll try to get to it in the last 10 minutes or so, 10, 15 minutes if we can. Xochitl, what are some of the historical antecedents that explain why unaccompanied minors are migrating to the US in such big numbers?
Well, that's a very complicated question, Roland, because there's so many things and so many different readings of the problem. But I would focus on three main problems. I think that the first one has to do with how the economic model in those countries has been created, in which it's not, it's very close and it's really not a shareable model. So therefore you have really a very few people who own land owners or businessmen who own the country. Literally in the case of Guatemala, I know there are 14 families who own everything pretty much. So when you have a model that it's so close economically, you of course are going to create a lot of disparities. And this has been happening since the 50s. So there is already precarity, and there has been, and it has to do with an economic model that doesn't share. And the second one, which I think it's very important, and it's what has been the big waves of migration that we've been seeing recently, are due to climate change. And this is something that probably Carlos can talk also about. And it has to do with both dryness, but also these torrential storms that have destroyed towns, and farmers, which were the only ones, the only ones making some money for subsistence, don't have any more options. But most recently, it's of course violence, and it has to do with gang violence, specifically two particular gangs, Mara Salvatrucha and Calle 18 or Calle 18, Street 18. And the problem with the cartelization, I don't know if that's a word or I just made it up, but cartelization of Central America is that there are really no options. When you reach 13 years of age, you're going to be recruited by the gangs if you're male. And if you don't want to participate, then they will kill some of your family members, or they'll threaten you until you become part of these groups, criminal organizations. And this is important to know, because a lot of these things are very much related with the United States and economic practices, and also specifically Mara Salvatrucha, as we know, was a gang that started in LA in the prisons of the United States. So I think it's important to see the big picture, but especially the geopolitical relations and the role that the United States have played, for instance, in the 80s in funding militias, these particular military groups that destroy governments, and democracy governments have been very scarce lately. So therefore, it's very complex, but I would say those three main aspects, which is economic disparities, climate change, and of course the violence. And the role that of course the United States have played in those issues.
Thank you, Xochitl. I have a question for Bernie from an audience member, and it may be a comment more than a question, but then you can take it as a license to comment in turn. This is the person I'm quoting. My concern is that originalism is not intellectually accurate if the meaning of the Constitution is said to be fixed. The Constitution is a political document as well as a document of compromise. Many of the clauses and concepts were the results of the framers kicking the can down the road for later consideration or interpretation rather than fixing the meaning in perpetuity, unquote.
Yes, so I think this comment is exactly apropos of my book, because one of the things I'm trying to do in the book is to suggest that this dichotomy between an idea of a written constitution that's permanently fixing meaning and common law constitutionalism that preceded it is really not apt. And that actually a lot of what is happening in the Constitution, especially if we look at rights provisions, is that they're writing down aspects of the common law, but that wasn't necessarily a means of securing those rights in time forever in the same state. They were securing them, but they weren't necessarily thinking of them as immutable at that time. And Jonathan Guinap in the history department has a really interesting book about how fixing the Constitution after the founding, really how the idea that the Constitution was written down didn't become something about its fixity until at least 10 years after it was composed. So I absolutely agree that the idea of fixation is inapt. And part of what I'm also arguing is fixation of what, because what originalists usually agree on is that we should look at the ratification meaning rather than the meaning of any particular of the framers. But once we look at ratification meanings, we see that the Constitution would probably be perceived somewhat differently according to the different legal schemes of the various states, that even if they had the same rights, they were being implemented in different ways. And so I think that that idea that it's not really fixed at the time of the founding is precisely what I'm trying to get at in a lot of my work.
Thank you. Here's a question for Carlos. Do you see some similarities between the way in which humans try to imprint an idea of what an environment should be or do, and the ways that nations, particularly understood in the framework of the 19th and early 20th century, try to create or shape their citizens?
Yeah, I saw that question in the chat from Mariela, so I'll have to thank her for that. It's a really great question. There's certainly huge similarities in the way that people identify as members of a nation, or I might add as members of an ethnicity or race, and the ways that they identify as part of what I'm calling an imagined environment. That's a central part of my project, to point out that in the humanities, we have quite a number of theories, principally for nationality, Benedict Anderson's theory of imagined communities, and for race and ethnicity, Edward Said's concept of the imaginative geography. But we haven't been as quick, perhaps because we have often, as humans, taken for granted as this sort of neutral backdrop for our more interesting affairs, this more than human or non-human world. But that's one of the things that I'm trying to call attention to, that much as we know all too well that states shape their subjects, that people treat one another as being part of a race or ethnicity, that we do very similar things to our non-human environment. But one of the things that I found in my research is that some of these tools that we have for thinking about nationality or race need to be modified when we start thinking about an environment. So one example, and this kind of routes a bit back to the questions about consciousness and unconsciousness. In the archives of this boundary commission that the US and Mexico set up to take a comprehensive look at the lands that Mexico ceded to the US in the mid-19th century. Within these archives, which ranged from anthropological sketches to astronomical observations to every type of map that you can imagine, that took hundreds of thousands of dollars and over a decade to create. Throughout these archives is an obsession with indigenous sign systems, particularly pictographs or rock paintings and petroglyphs or rock etchings. And the constant refrain of these state-sanctioned experts is that these are just rude markings or these nonsensical scratches that are just signs of how superior the US and Mexico were to the hundreds of distinct indigenous inhabitants of this region. But one of the things that is completely crazy about these archives is you can look at them and see their copies of native sign systems, of petroglyphs and pictographs, and trace them back to their original sources. You can actually take the printed page and match it up exactly with an etched or scratched stone somewhere, and see not just 1,000 years, but in some cases 10,000 years. They're Jornada Mogollon pictographs that these people unintentionally recorded as part of their efforts to cast aspersion on these indigenous sign systems. And one of the things that I've done in my book is talk a bit about the Mescalero Apache imagined environments that you can see emerging as a sort of unconscious in the Freudian sense within this colonial archive. And one of the things that's very interesting to me is that Mescalero Apaches didn't think of themselves as a nation or a race in the European and Euro-American senses. But one of the things I found is they did insist on their long-standing roots in and ties to this particular place in the Chihuahuan Desert and the surrounding mountains. So a theory of imagined environments can help us appreciate these distinctive ways of making community and understanding and using the land that aren't necessarily nations or races.
Thank you. Wonderful. Xochitl, tell us more, if you will, about the process you observed when a minor is apprehended at the border and wishes to apply for asylum. That's one question. And then slightly different question, for those who are watching who are concerned about this situation that you are analyzing, what can we do? What should we do?
Thank you, Roland. Well, I mean, so the process, once you get into into the border is you get apprehended at the border, and DHS will put you into a shelter. And the shelter, you're supposed to be there for 72 hours. In reality, they stay there for approximately 3 months. In those 3 months, you need to find a sponsor, and a sponsor can be a family member or a friend who is willing to sponsor the kid. And then that kid will fly to that particular state or city. Now, this is really important to mention. Where you end up landing is actually your chances of getting asylum are bigger or not. So for instance, if you land in California, 99% of the asylum, the asylum seeker minors who apply get granted the asylum, 99%. In Georgia, where I live right now, 1%. So as you can see, again, talking about how the law differs, how you read different laws, how do you apply the law differs greatly. So, so you fly to the family, you apply for asylum, and if you get granted asylum, you get 1 year work permit so that the kid can work legally and go to school for a year and then apply for a green card. And this process takes approximately between a year and a year and a half. So between a year and a half, the kid will be legal if they are applying for asylum. Now, during the asylum interview, that's what I'm saying, that where you land matters a lot. And what we're seeing right now, I mean, the overcrowded places, it started with the Trump administration, of course, because he stopped expediting these processes. So therefore, all the kids who came stay without, and he froze all of the asylum petitions. So we have a backlog of approximately 72,000 kids that are in these centers, which, what do you do with them? Again, going back to my previous comment, you cannot just let them out. Some people are furious because they are in cages, but they're not necessarily in cages. Some of them are really in condensed spaces, but you need a program to free them. Otherwise, they will be in the streets by themselves. And what can we do? What can we do? Well, I think that what we can do is get informed, get involved. I mean, we all know different languages. I mean, we all have friends who maybe are able to sponsor a kid, and sponsoring a kid doesn't mean you're going to live with the kid forever. It just means that you are securing that person is going to arrive at a home and be fed and be clean, etc. So we can all be sponsors if we want to. We can also explain to people, I think, that the complexities of this problem, because I think that in the United States, there's a rhetoric, anti-immigrant rhetoric, that they don't understand that, again, some of these conditions of this migration were created here in the United States. So I think that as a role as scholars, also as educators, is to explain some of these relationships, that the world is like, especially Mexico and Central America and the United States have a history that it's really inseparable. So Carlo Lomnitz, who is probably, anthropology historian at Columbia University, has said that Mexico and Central America has a relationship with the United States like the northern and the southern of Italy. So they are that intertwined. So so get involved in the sense of helping in any way that you can, recruit people and sponsor someone if you feel that you have the space and the capacity.
Now, in our last 15 minutes, I'm gonna do what I said and invite any of the three of you to pose a question to another one.
I have one. I'm sorry if I just spoke, but Bernie, I've been dying to ask you this question. How do you see the Constitution and the Bible, as objects, that are both very sacred, very different, but in the United States, they seem to have almost, I might be wrong, an equal weight. So can you talk about these two texts that are so sacred and so important, and their relationship, if there's anything that you can say about that? Thank you, Bernie.
Yeah, I think that's a fabulous question. And in a way, actually, the beginnings of kind of the law and literature movement talked a lot about the relation between biblical and constitutional hermeneutics, right? And I think that the way that people think about the Constitution really does have a lot to do with that kind of hermeneutic tradition that comes out of the Bible. And precisely because, what someone like Schleiermacher at the beginnings of hermeneutics said was, well, you have to posit a perfect author because it's the Bible. And you have to posit that, there will be this kind of consistent text and consistent set of principles, because God, if God is the source of it, then how are you going to think otherwise, right? So similarly, I think the idea is that the Constitution has this, has to be reconciled with itself. It has to be presenting this unified whole, and so I think a lot of the techniques of interpretation are shared. But I think it's also quite remarkable how many titles of books about the Constitution have this kind of religiosity in their names, right? There's a book, Constitutional Fidelity, there's Constitutional Faith, there's, Constitutional Redemption. I could go on with all of the titles, but there is this real coalescence, I think, around the Constitution as a kind of quasi-sacred document of the Republic. And then I think also different practices of interpretation, I think, could be seen as having to do with, different forms of religious tradition. I had a student who did a great piece on the sort of rise of certain forms of Protestant biblical interpretation and the relation to the simultaneous rise of the Tea Party and their modes of constitutional interpretation. So I think there are even particular religious strains within this. And an advisor of mine wrote actually a piece on the 10 Commandments and the Bill of Rights, right? Or, you have 10 winding up together, right? So there's this kind of structural similarity too. So I think that there are all sorts of connections, and it's a fruitful area of investigation. Can I ask you a question? Because I wanted to ask you a question also.
Of course.
So I think this idea of of care at the heart of your project is so fascinating. And I wanted to try to ask where trust or lack of trust also might fit in there. And I'm thinking in particular in relation to language, because when I was a judicial law clerk, we came across a lot of cases. And by the time, we were at the Court of Appeal. So by that time, it was very hard to kind of overturn the initial decision of an asylum judge because the standard of review was extremely elevated. But it was so clear from the transcripts of a lot of cases that there had been a communication mistake due to translation often, or due to some kind of lack of kind of being on the same page interpretively. And the default was lack of trust, right? So the default was to assume that any inconsistency was a source of suspicion and was actually a demonstration of lack of reliability. So I'm just kind of wondering where trust fits in your narrative, or if it does.
Oh, absolutely, Bernie. That's a great question. And it has to do with denotational accuracy, right? I mean, if you say that you did something in September, and then in the next day you say it was October because, you don't really know, that alone, it's enough to deny asylum, you're lying. But the interesting thing, Bernie, is that with children, that doesn't apply. I've witnessed that. So with men and women, I mean, these inconsistencies are completely based for denial. Whereas with children, again, my experience with the UCIS officers in California who were really trying to help these kids, right, were always, so for instance, in one case, one of the kids was asked, "Are you afraid to go back to Honduras?" And she was like, "No, I'm not afraid." If you say that, you cannot apply for asylum. And then the UCIS officer and the lawyer were trying to make questions in order to, go behind that and talk, not to ask that direct question. So trust is a very important, I think you get it right. It's very important in the judicial space, but not with children, because children, again, being seen as they're in a becoming stage. They are not yet adults. So therefore, every inconsistency is always seen within that context of, well, you are still not, you don't know, you're very young. So therefore, they get a lot of leeway to say pretty much whatever they want. So that's something that I think I want to write about that. I need to do some more research about that, but how inconsistencies in children, they're fine, not in adults though. So yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Bernie.
Xochitl, can I just follow up? I was very captivated by your incisive summary of the factors forcing migrants to seek refuge in the United States. And I guess I'm wondering, how do you think that this set of driving forces, I mean, you cited economic inequality, crimes, and climate change or environmental catastrophe. How are those mediated through childhood consciousness? Like, how do you see or hear or listen to children as theorists of problems in their home communities? What sorts of things do they say? How do they convey this information?
That's a great question. And it's a question that is going to be difficult to answer, because when I meet the children, they have already been coached by the lawyers, right? So their discourses are already being mediated. So it's not that I meet them when they just arrived, but I am with the lawyer that they've been working with for several months. So the stories that they're telling are already stories that have been shaped by, I mean, that sounds kind of hard. I mean, it's not shaped. They are very, they are told you have to talk about this, this, and this. And one of the things that they are not allowed to talk is economic precarity, because an economic migrant will never get asylum. You have to tell a story about abandonment, about discrimination in the basis of different things. So, so the stories that I hear are usually about the fears that they have about the Mara Salvatruchas or the Calle 18. So that's the focus that the lawyers are, I think, steering them, because then they belong to a particular group, kids from 12 to 18. So therefore they will be recruited. Sometimes when I take them to get their permits, they tell me a little bit more about their own stories, and all of them wants to be back, right? And that's the sad part. And that's why I think it's important to talk about agency, because I mean, I myself, as I explained when I presented this, I think that the kids should stay in the United States, and I am a big advocate of that, but their desires and their stories point to a different desire. Yeah, I mean, they want to be back with their grandma, with their friends, with their spouses. So I don't really have an answer for that, Carlos. It's a great question. And I think that if I start to do more field work and hopefully go, which is my idea, to go to El Salvador and Honduras, maybe I can get some of those ideas. How do they really conceptualize this? But they're forced to leave. Their parents are the ones who are sending them. They're not willingly coming here. That's for sure. Thank you, Carlos.
Yeah. We're about to wrap up in a few minutes, but I want to take a moment to ask one final question for all three of you, and maybe to invite sort of brief answers to this. What is an important thing about your topic that often gets overlooked in public discourse, for instance, in journalism or when politicians talk about your topic? If you're going to leave our audience with one thing that you want them to remember that is that supplements or corrects or expands on what they're going to hear tomorrow when they hear about your topic on the news, what would you tell them? Xochitl, you can go first.
Well, so I think that the most important thing, it's definitely the geopolitical context that had created this particular migration pattern, and that it always gets erased in all of the stories. It's just the governments in those countries are corrupt. There's a lot of violence. These are I don't know, almost primitive. They use sometimes those words, and they want to come here because there's wealth and there's well-being, and the truth is way more different. So I would say that for me, what angers me the most is the lack of context of why this is happening and the role that the United States had played in these migrations.
Context, thank you. Yeah, Bernie.
Well, I think one of the things that most gets overlooked about originalism in particular is that it actually works more to disrupt rather than to continue constitutional tradition, so that it's used as a way to pass over a lot of intervening precedents that came between the founding, or say the 14th Amendment, and today, and return to an earlier moment. So I think that in the name of history or a past moment, it's actually erasing a lot of intervening time.
Okay, thank you. And Carlos, you get the last word.
Well, about the US-Mexico borderlands in particular, I would encourage folks to remember that any of the events that are transpiring in this region now are shaped indelibly by the longer history, first or more recently of US colonialism, but before that of Spanish and Mexican colonialism. This is a multiply colonized place where race and ethnicity and language and other axes of identity and the way that all of these human communities relate to the environment is shaped by these multi-century long processes of colonization. And more abstractly or more broadly, I'd encourage folks to remember that any experience that we humans have of a more than human world, our more than human planet ultimately, that's never the only story or the only subjective experience. There are always alternatives out there. And rather than simply trying to evangelize about our own perspectives and share them to others, we also need to listen to the other perspectives that already exist.
Thank you. I want, on behalf of the audience, I want to extend our deep thanks to the three of you as presenters, and in turn, on behalf of the center, I want to thank our audience for being with us today. To our audience members, if you are new to the Stanford Humanities Center, I hope that the ideas and the questions that we've shared here serve to lend you a sense of what we do. We've hardly touched on the exchanges that go on under our roof. And now that you've heard these three scholars discuss their work, imagine that in normal times, they and the other 40 or so fellows cross paths often, have lunch several times a week together, and hear each other's work develop over the run of the year, both in formal presentations and in casual conversation. What we have staged here for 90 minutes happens every day at the center times 10. Please follow us online, support us if you can, but above all, spread the word about the work of the Stanford Humanities Center. Our next event will take place right here on June 2nd. Frederick Clark of the University of Southern California, who has spent the year at the center with Xochitl, Bernie, and Carlos, will speak in our series Inside the Center on his new book, The First Pagan Historian, The Fortunes of a Fraud from Antiquity to the Enlightenment, which is about a history supposedly by an eyewitness to the Trojan War that remained influential for centuries despite being a fake. You can find details on our website, of course, shc.stanford.edu, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.